Hey everybody, this is Garrett with Earth and Time, and today we're going to learn about some of the geology of Nevada at the Nevada State Museum in Carson City, Nevada, the capital of that state. They have an amazing exhibit here. They walk us through the history and time of the Earth, where Nevada sits today. They have cool things like this ichthyosaur fossil behind me, which is actually the state fossil of Nevada, that we can learn more about the environment in which they lived here in Nevada. So with that being said, let's get to it. Welcome to Nevada's Changing Earth, a fantastic exhibit on the geology of Nevada, and it's here because geology is so central to the success of Nevada. It's geology and understanding geology that helped them find the silver here that made Nevada what is known as the silver state, the silver state. It's also what helped in place the gold that's here. And Nevada is the third largest producing region of gold in the world, only beaten by Australia and South Africa. Pretty amazing, and something that I don't think most people know about. So all of that has helped the museum, and the understanding that it's helped sponsor the museum and this exhibit. So looking at what Nevada looked like through time, starting all the way in the Precambrian. So the Precambrian was basically the time before life was on the earth. And what I like that they've done through this exhibit is we're talking about Nevada. So again, we're at the Nevada State Museum, and they have the outline of what Nevada, or where Nevada was in space, and then what was going on during different times. So you can see, over 1.5 billion years ago, you'll see that there was actually a bunch of island arcs coming in, colliding with what's known as Archean cratons. So this would have been something similar like what you can think about areas like along the Ring of Fire today, right? You have islands and you have subducting crust and oceanic crust running into the continent. Places like the Andes, right, are popping up because of things like that. Really, really interesting exhibit, and I like how they've done this. And they show some of the rocks from that time period that you can actually find within Nevada. Now, I'm not going to go through every single rock in here, but if you come to this museum, which I highly recommend you do, you come here, you support them, you come and learn, you can learn about this geologic history of Nevada and the actual history of Nevada as well, the people part of the history. The next jump in time they go to is 700 million years ago. So still a long time ago, and very hard to fathom these kinds of numbers, right? Considering that we live in decades, maybe a century if you're lucky, and we're talking millions of years. Even thousands of years is hard for us to understand, but over millions of years, you can see the environment in which Nevada resided in change. So here's from 700 million years ago, and look what it looked like with over double that amount of time, right? Over 1 billion years ago, you can see it was a very different type of world there. So what's driving that? Well, what's really driving these changes in these different time periods are plate tectonics. And all plate tectonics are, in the simplest terms, is just saying the Earth is made up of a bunch of individual plates that move through time, and that's why we have things like earthquakes. And here's a nice example of where those plates are today. And I already mentioned things like the Ring of Fire, right? What's known as a subduction zone that creates a bunch of volcanics. The San Andreas Fault, most people are familiar with, lies over here. You can see these outlines of these plate boundaries, and you can see things like where South America and Africa fit together, or once fit together, and then now have been separated over a long period of time. And so all those clues helped us understand that the Earth is constantly in a state of motion, and that's why when we look at these different images of where Nevada was during certain times, it looks like there's a different type of geology or different world. We could be on a continent like where I'm standing today, or I could have been in the middle of the ocean during one time, because the Earth is a dynamic place. So now we've talked about plate tectonics a little bit. What's actually going on as we start stepping forward in time to the Paleozoic era? So this is really when life starts occurring on Earth, and more complex types of life. Pre this, they're really single-celled organisms, so you can see like blue-green algae, stromatolite type features. Now we're going to start talking about more complex life forms, and they actually have a nice exhibit in here that we'll walk through now. So if I walk into this exhibit, it's going to show us what the ocean in Nevada would have looked like during what was known as the Devonian. So this was known as the time of fish, and we'll take a look at where Nevada sat during that time. But you can take a look at the unique types of life forms that were discovered in rocks as fossils in here. And this is a nice diorama of what that world would have looked like, including some of my favorites, little trilobites and the corals. And so the rocks that we can look at as geologists and as paleontologists, as we look at rocks, we can see these clues in these rocks of what these environments look like. And we can study modern environments. Although the life forms aren't exactly the same, they probably lived a similar way. You know, a fish is still a fish. They maybe look a little different, but a fish still lived in the ocean, had gills, had a certain way it had to live. And so we can get some clues. A coral reef is still some kind of coral reef. As far as we know, they acted pretty similarly. All right, so let's learn a little bit more about what Nevada looked like during the time period of the Paleozoic coming into this Devonian time. This is what Nevada would look like during that time where you saw the fish. So Nevada would have been in the middle of a deep ocean, or at least the eastern half would be more of a shallow ocean, which is probably where those fish would have been living, so close to Utah or the border of Utah. But as you came towards California, this would have been a deep ocean, something like you can think of like the Pacific Ocean or out in the Atlantic Ocean today. And as time went on, because of plate tectonics, the region started to change. Eventually you ended up with some island arcs coming in due to some subduction that started to occur, and you ended up with volcanic island arcs coming through here in a series of what we call thrust zones coming on top of the central portion of Nevada in what was known as the antler orogeny. And we can see examples of these in the geology today, and that's what these pictures are, is they're showing us, well, we can see what these look like. In fact, here's a nice example of one of those thrust faults on here that we can piece together what these things look like today and figure out how did they get there through time. So I also say geology is like being a forensic scientist and an artist at the same time, because you've got to really think in 3 and truly 4-dimensional space. And that thrust fault we just saw the picture of was this one, the Golconda thrust zone. And you can see where Nevada is during this time. Now over towards Utah and eastern Nevada, you're actually on a continent or land, and it's ocean off on the western side towards what is California today. And there's a series of these thrust faults bringing the land up. And how do we know there was life here in Nevada during that time? Well, we have fossils. So we can see lots of different fossils from corals, and we see corals still that look like this today very much. We have other kinds of fossils of sea lilies, which there are examples of those, right? Around still, crinoids is what they're called. We can see examples of shells. So we can still see shells today. So it gives us an idea what kind of environment they would have lived in. And then some more shells that we can see. So we can take all those clues and figure out what was the environment like at any one place where we're seeing those at. And eventually, we can see this is a bark from a fern tree. There are actually trees here in Nevada. So that means that here we had to go from an ocean environment into some kind of terrestrial or land environment through time, where we actually started having trees. It's pretty cool and a lot of fun to start pulling these stories all together. And again, being like really we're an earth forensic scientist. From the Paleozoic, or kind of early life forms, we get to the Mesozoic, which is my favorite because this is the time of the dinosaurs. So what was happening in Nevada during the time of the dinosaurs? Well, the early time of the dinosaurs, we can see Nevada here, and they actually split it in 2 so you can see what was going on in between. Is you actually had a subduction zone again, but kind of going the other direction from what we saw before. And we had sand dunes off towards the the east of Nevada, which is places like, you can think of like Zion National Park, these giant, basically Sahara deserts that were developing on land and then coming into these ocean environments. So you can think of a lot of places, maybe like Egypt today or Tunisia, kind of the areas where the Sahara or these big sand, big deserts come to the coast, is a very similar environment to those what we see in Africa today in a number of places. Would have been happening during this early time of the Mesozoic. Now, the other thing that's cool here is you'll see it says see ichthyosaur exhibit. So ichthyosaurs, which are basically reptilian dolphins, lived during this time, and we can find a whole bunch of their fossils here in Nevada. So we know during this time they were living through this section, which is probably similar to how dolphins live today, kind of in these shallower sea areas, eating fish and finding food, and potentially living in groups as well, which is really an interesting thought. So what happens post that? Well, is we have subduction continuing, we have accretion and building of the continent, and you end up with things like the Sierra Nevada arc. So we're all familiar, or most people are familiar with Sierra Nevada mountains. So this is when you're starting to build the Sierra Nevada mountains. In fact, the Sierra Nevada batholith is what's exposed today in places like Lake Tahoe and make it so beautiful, right? But it was getting in place during this middle time of the Mesozoic, and you can see there's a lot going on in here. Now, I don't know of very many dinosaur fossils from this time period in northern Nevada. I believe they found some here in southern Nevada, and then of course the Triassic or the early Mesozoics when we found the ichthyosaurs, which were actually not dinosaurs, but aquatic reptiles. And then what did Nevada look like during the late time of the dinosaurs? Well, it was mostly land all through here, and you had a series of valleys setting up and rivers and lakes that would have occurred here within this Nevada time frame. Now, one of the issues we have is we know this was happening, but there's later events that chop all this up that make it very difficult to maybe find some of the fossils that we'd expect to find here. Like in Utah, because of the Colorado Plateau, we find lots and lots of dinosaur fossils because those layers were well preserved and stayed fairly horizontal and flat. They weren't broken up a lot. However, here in Nevada, later tectonics or later faulting started breaking this whole region up. And so the dinosaur fossils aren't quite as abundant in this area as I mentioned before. So following the Mesozoic, we come to the Cenozoic era, which gets us closer to the more modern era. So let's take a look at what's happening in Nevada during that time. So the Cenozoic era is from 65 million years ago to the present. So it turns out this was an area of a lot of volcanic activity post 65 million years ago, and you'll see this is from 35 million years ago. We have lots of evidence here in Nevada of these large calderas, super volcanoes they call them. So imagine something like Yellowstone, right? These gigantic volcanoes that exist and just would explode all over the landscapes here that were associated with the dying out of the subduction that helped set up things like the Sierra Nevada batholith. And that's what we start seeing during this later time of the Cenozoic. We see a lot of volcanism that we can understand. Now, the reason there's kind of a gap here is because a lot of this volcanism probably destroyed a lot of the earlier rock material. It makes it very hard to piece together what was happening during certain times. So we actually lose information about what's happening in the earth due to later events, often in geology. So much, again, like a forensic scientist, or if you will, like Sherlock Holmes, we have to go back and try to piece together the puzzle or the mystery based on little clues. So 20 million years ago now, we've stepped forward. We start having things going on off to the west of us. We have the Farallon Plate. This will eventually set up the San Andreas Fault Zone out there. We still have volcanoes popping off in California. You'll see the ancestral Colorado River starts coming through the southern portion of Nevada here, and you can still see where Nevada's at. And volcanism is still pretty abundant during this time. And along with that, we're starting to develop the early versions of what's known as the Basin Range that we see today. And now we jump to 5 million years ago, and you can really see that Basin Range topography. One term described as looking like a bunch of caterpillars marching across the surface of the land. But basically what happens here is the earth is pulling apart here, so you end up with these normal faults. So just like you'd pull anything apart, you're going to end up with cracks in it, and there's going to be low and high areas that develop. And that's exactly what the Basin Range is. You end up with these low and high regions across here, abutted up against the uplifting and helping to uplift the Sierra Nevada batholith that we saw was being developed back in the Jurassic, the mid-time of the dinosaurs. And we can start seeing things like the San Andreas Fault in California developing during this time 5 million years ago. So still a lot of dynamic activity here. In fact, there's even earthquakes. There's actually been some significant earthquakes here in the Basin Range. So it's a seismically active region, just like the San Andreas. And because of that, this chops up a lot of what we know about the past. Because of this extension and chopping up of the landscapes, it makes it a lot harder to piece together the story of what was happening in Nevada through time. So the fact we know as much as we do is due to a lot of hard work, millions of hours of geologist time and scientist time to try to understand this story. And here's a really nice look of a map of Nevada showing the modern topography going from Las Vegas to the south, coming across. You can see the basin and range texture. So here's your range or your mountains and your basins in between. Working all the way to the northern part of Nevada, you can see that same type of topography. And then I can zoom in on where we're at right now, which is in Carson City, right here. And you can see Lake Tahoe off to the side and Reno to the north. Still within this area of the Basin Range. As we come more to the present, there's a lot of things happening in here, including a giant lake named Lake Lahontan that left a bunch of basically desert corals from freshwater lakes. We had forests that were here in a wetter time that were later buried and the trees were fossilized, and actually it's because water moved through it later on. Hot water deposited opals, which is really neat. We even used to have redwoods or giant sequoias here in Nevada that are now long since gone due to the changing climates. And of course, some of the coolest things we had here were mastodons, mammoths, and things like proto-horses and proto-camels lived in this area. And we can actually find bones of these animals, as well as there's actually places where we can see the trackways where they were living in these marshy areas or walking around. And this would have been during the Pleistocene, so this would have been really the last ice age. So why do we care so much about geology and what was happening through time here? Well, geology affects a lot of things, including where minerals are in place, and especially precious minerals we need for day-to-day life. Things like gold and silver that helps with our electronics, copper, right? Gypsum, which we use for drywall, limestone that we use for our cement. All of these things are from the earth, and it takes geologists to understand where they're at and how they got there. So we need to understand the geologic history of the earth to be predictive and to find where these are at. Like here are some beautiful examples of azurite and malachite, a copper ore, and even things like native copper that they find here and that we need to use. Of course, things like gold and silver, right? So there's gold within these rocks that we use on a regular basis, not just for jewelry, but for electronics as well. Actually, here's a really nice piece, a really nice gold nugget. We also need to understand the earth to understand geologic hazards to human beings, like where do we think earthquakes are going to happen? So we need to study faults, know where faults are at, so we can inform people and be prepared for things like earthquakes. And this shows an example of what an earthquake looks like on a seismograph. We also need to understand the earth for energy. So right now, there's a lot of work being done on geothermal energy, so using hot water to turn turbines to generate electricity. And a lot of that work is being done here in Nevada and Utah and the western US. And so you need to understand geology to understand where those types of places exist. Now, this is an example from Fly Ranch, which we're told never. It's a beautiful example of some travertine and sinter coming out of hot springs. Not an area they'll ever truly develop for geothermal, but it's the idea of this hot water here. So I want to end where I started, in front of the ichthyosaur over here. Thank you all for joining me to learn about the geology and fossils of Nevada. I thought that was fascinating. I've lived here, I've gone to school here, and I always learn something new as I walk through this exhibit. I hope you learned something new also. Feel free to leave comments down below. Love to hear from you. If you do enjoy this video and enjoy this channel, you all know what to do already. So with that being said, everybody take care, and thank you so much for watching.